So we looked at white culture in the South. Let's look at black culture, African American culture. Slavery was called the peculiar institution by whites. And what they mean by that is not weird. What they mean by that is it's special. Now, most countries in the world have abandoned slavery by this time. They've made it illegal. In fact, aside from the American South, only Brazil, Cuba, and Puerto Rico still allow slavery in the Western world. And slavery isn't allowed anywhere in Europe. But one of the things slavery led to is the development of a black culture. There were varieties of slavery. But one thing that was fairly consistent were slave codes. These were laws that applied to slaves. Slaves were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to leave their plantation without permission, to be out after dark, to congregate, except at church, own a weapon, testify in court, strike a white person, even in self-defense, or learn to read or write. Slave marriage and divorce were not recognized by the law. That's not to say they didn't happen. They just weren't legal institutions. They were private things slaves did on their own. A white can kill their own slave legally with no punishment whatsoever. But if a black even resists a white person, the punishment is death. You may ask yourself, since mixed race has become so prevalent today in our society, how black is black? Well, the answer was simple. One drop. One drop of black blood meant that you were black. Now, to be fair, these laws weren't enforced evenly. In some places and some plantations, slave owners were fairly kind, by the standards of slave owners. And in other places, they were going to be much, much, much more harsh. And slave codes could be used as often or as little as the society saw fit. But typically, the master handled punishment. Since he had the power to legally kill his slaves, he didn't often need to turn to the law. On larger plantations where there were lots of slaves, unique societies would develop, as well as power structures we'll talk about. But one thing to understand on plantations is the role of the overseer and the head driver. These were people who organized the work crews, and in some situations, they might even be slaves themselves. Slaves ate cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses. They would occasionally get meat and poultry, but of course, they were basically seen as machines, and there wasn't much cause to give them more than they needed. So they were fed because they had to be able to work, but they weren't fed lavishly. They lived in slave quarters. We were looking here at some slave houses. And they were given cheap clothes and shoes. Larger plantations would keep a doctor on staff there on the plantation to look after them because a sick slave or an injured slave couldn't work. They were concerned with the health of the slave. Although the slave mother was really the primary care provider. If a slave got sick, the first person they would go to is their mom or whoever served as their mom, because very likely their mom wasn't around. They worked as children. As early as 4 or 5 years old, they would be expected to do regular supervised work, although they would have specialized jobs for the little ones, of course. Women worked in fields, they raised kids, and they did domestic work. Families were often broken up through sale, as some plantation owners did not care who was related to who, although some did. Life expectancy, as you can imagine, was short. There were house slaves and field slaves. It was physically easier to work in the house. You would maybe get a chance to eat the leftovers from the whites' table, which were probably much better than what the slaves were being eaten. And you would probably develop close relationship with the whites, although I wouldn't quite say you were friends. White plantation owners tended to think of house slaves often as their friends, but we know that the slaves, of course, harbored a lot of resentment. The downside to being in the house is you're much closer supervised. There's somebody watching you pretty much all the time, whereas in the field you may only be checked up on periodically and be expected to have a certain amount of work done. And of course, women in the houses were very often preyed on sexually by any males who lived in the house. We usually think of the master of the house, but it could be his sons, it could be his father, it could be any male in the house. And of course, since they were treated as sex objects and used for sex by the men in the house, the women in the house very frequently were unpleasant towards them, seeing them as competition. Not all slaves lived on the plantation. I don't have a picture for it, but some slaves lived in cities. And these slaves interacted with lots of people, not just the other people on their slaves. Some slaves lived in cities because their masters lived in cities, or their master might have a house in a city and the slave stayed there full time to keep up the house. But there were also slaves who had certain skills, and they would be hired out by the master. So you might be a master slave on a cotton plantation, but never really work on the plantation or do much with cotton. You might be hired out to be a miner, a lumber worker, a dock worker, do construction, drive wagons. If you had a particular skill that was valuable, say you were a blacksmith or a carpenter, the master might open up a shop for you to work in the city, and then you were expected to give him all the money you made. But when the shop wasn't open, your time was essentially yours, and you would have much more freedom without the regular supervision that other slaves would have. There were free blacks, of course. There were about 250,000, 250,000 free blacks in the South. Some had bought their freedom with side income. They might do other work. They might fix things or make things and sell them. Women might do laundry and save up money, which was possible in some plantations. Some were freed by their masters. It wouldn't be uncommon for a master that was very close to a slave to free him in their will. So I'm died and I don't need your service anymore, and you're free. But after the Nat Turner Rebellion, it becomes illegal to free slaves. A few cases, former slaves actually got rich themselves and owned slaves themselves. There are cases of former slaves owning slaves when they become successful. Blacks, of course, wanted to be free. And this is evident. We can prove this because after the Civil War, virtually no slaves chose to stay on as servants, or very few anyway. So how do you react to slavery? Well, there's a combination of adaptation and resistance. There were different images of the slave. The Sambo was a word for the slave that did what the whites expected. This is the yes and no, that sort of slave. And then, of course, you had the rebels. Well, how do you rebel? You might just work slow. You might break the tools. Well, we can't do any more work today. The tools are broken. There were a few. You might intentionally injure yourself. There were a few actual slave rebellions. But the whites lived in constant terror that the slaves would organize and fight back against them. In fact, it was probably a nightmare to be a slave owner because you had that constantly hanging over your head that the slaves might organize and come after you. In 1800, a slave named Gabriel Prosser organized 1,000 slaves outside of Richmond, Virginia. But the militia got wind, put the revolt down, and executed 36 of the slaves. In 1822, a freed slave, Denmark Vesey, supposedly organized 9,000 slaves in a revolt, but word of the attack leaked before it began and was able to be stopped. The most successful revolt was 1831 when Nat Turner organized the slaves on his plantation, killed them, moved on to the next plantation, gathering slaves as he went. And in the end, 60 whites ended up dead. They were stopped by the Virginia militia with more than 100 of the rebellious slaves being executed. You could run away. There was an underground railroad developed a little later in this period that would try to sneak you to the north, but it had a pretty low success rate. Blacks required travel permits, and so if you were seen in public, you had to show proof that you were free. And of course, there was really no way to get these unless you were actually free. So most rebellion took the form of slowdowns, broken equipment, stealing maybe, hurting yourself, and of course the ultimate protest, suicide.